Okay, class. Today we're going to look at this concept of manifest destiny, which leads us to the final conflict, big conflict before the Civil War, which is the Mexican-American War. After Jackson's stepping down after 2 terms, and you have Martin Van Buren succeeding him, which was like his chosen successor. The next election comes with the rise of the Whig Party, which emerged as an opposition to Andrew Jackson. And in winning the White House is William Henry Harrison, who was a Whig, and gets elected in 1841. His with John Tyler as his vice president, Daniel Webster as his cabinet, Henry Clay's, in the Senate, and basically this is an entire Whig ticket. Now, William Henry Harrison, holds the record for having the shortest term in office. Now, if you ever it's a cold outside and your mom tells you put on a coat, you might catch a cold. Well, maybe Henry Harrison should have taken that advice, because in his inauguration, it's kind of chilly out. He refuses to wear his coat and he catches pneumonia and he actually passes away only 4 weeks into office. So it is, John Tyler that succeeds him as president. Now, going back to Texas, we talked a little bit about him about the state of Texas under the Andrew Jackson PowerPoint. But let's look back at, a little bit more about Texas, as this is going to lead us towards the Mexican-American War. Now, Texas has fought his war for independence, but they had Santa Anna sign a treaty at gunpoint. Mexico never recognizes its independence. So first of all, they don't see it as an independent state. And then when Texas tries to get the United States to annex it, Mexico complains you cannot annex Mexican territory. And so Mexico keeps up a defense, trying to plan for further reconquest of Texas. But at the same time, Texas is quickly trying to solidify itself and get some allies. They reach out to places like Great Britain and France, and in hopes to get some sort of recognition and start some sort of peace treaties, or, some sort of also economic treaties, because, Texas is a big cotton producer. And Britain and France look at Texas as, if we can recognize them and support them as a country, we can try to slow down or block any further expansion of the United States. There's other people that have visions for Texas. Could be one really silly one, coming from Great Britain, thinking they're going to end slavery there, make it a free state. But I mean, the whole reason there's a war in Texas is to keep slavery. Great Britain also saw Texas as a place that during that tariff abominations, they could get goods technically into America through Texas, because they weren't holding up those tariffs, and they could sell more there. So, Great Britain looked at Texas like, we could do something here, and maybe they could produce enough cotton, so we're not, we're not beholden to American cotton. And once again, because they're quite angry about this tariff abominations and so forth. And this becomes like the leading issue in the presidential election of 1844. What are we going to do with Texas? There's people that want to annex it. There's people that don't want to annex it, because they see Texas annexation as just adding another slave state. And there's a lot of, and then of course there's a whole other people with this manifest destiny concept, this idea that, America should stretch from one coast to the other coast, and we're looking to expand the South, and we're looking to expand slavery. And so you had a lot of people, it's like, it's either you let Texas in or it's disunion, meaning, we're going to separate from the Union if you don't let Texas in. And this is the common threat with the South. It finally comes true in 1861, but anytime they feel complete, really aggrieved by something the North does, they always look to seceding from the North and becoming their own country. Now, the first real push is to annex, for a vote in annexation that doesn't go through. They don't get enough votes. They have to do like a joint resolution. And after a bunch of debate between both houses, Texas is admitted to the 28th state. All the while, Mexico complaining, you cannot annex Mexican territory. This is not an independent state. We've never recognized its independence, and so we don't recognize the right of you to take it. Now, one of the reasons also that some Americans leaned toward Texas wasn't just like the slave state, free state whole thing. They just kind of figured that Texas was allowing for a lot of other countries to make their way into, the continental United States, and perhaps not only check expansion, but invade Texas. So they saw it as like, we need to get Texas to protect the United States. So in 1844, we have two people nominated for president, and it's Henry Clay and James Polk. And James Polk runs on this concept of manifest destiny. This is built upon when we talk about John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill. This idea that the United States had such a great society and was ordained by God to spread its light across the continent, and bring civilization to the uncivilized, to the barbaric people of Mexico and the Native Americans. And so they just felt like this was in the United States, whole purpose was to do this and take over the Americas. And so this is what is at the head of, where at the head of what was going to be argued about when we look at what president are we going to vote for in the United States. And, not only are they looking for a president that will support this manifest destiny of expansionism, they still look at Clay as like part of that whole corrupt bargain that Jackson brought up. And so, a lot of people are not willing to forgive him that. And so, it was really in the end, the issue of Texas as like who got elected president. It was Texas as the forefront of everything. And when the election results come back, it's really Polk comes out on top. And in certain areas, there was a third party, especially in New York, known as the Liberty Party. And third parties are notorious for one thing, taking votes. And Henry Clay loses in New York because there was a bunch of votes taken by this third party, this anti-slavery party. And so they're able to take enough votes to remove enough votes of the Electoral College and throw it Polk's way for Polk to be elected. Polk took that as a mandate to go forward with his ambitions of expanding into Texas and even further negotiating with Great Britain to try to get the Oregon Territory, settle the border there, and what part is British and what part is American. And he moves forward with this like 4-point plan of what I'm going to do in my first 4 years as president. And he pretty much does most of what he says he's going to do. First things first, he's going to lower the tariff, that tariff of abominations. It's still pretty high. People wanted to lower it. And he's able to get that passed. The Walker tariff bill makes it past Congress, and it lowers some of the tariff percentages from 32 to 25, and actually does prove to make money for the United States because it opens up all these other markets internationally. This move also that in order to promote business, you needed an independent treasury, you needed to set up some sort of banking system, was still up in the air and something that they were still looking to do. And the other parts of it were like I mentioned earlier, Oregon, where we're going to put the border between British Canada and the part that the United States claims. And so this all was having to do with like where and who was squatting in what area of the Oregon territories. You had more Americans living than British, so they're laying claim to the land simply by right of like occupation. Eventually, there is a proposal at the 49th parallel that this will be where the border of Oregon is, and it kind of it's a compromise between Britain and America that we wanted more land, but it was a good compromise thrown to the Senate. It was accepted, and that becomes the border, the northern border between the United States and Oregon. Great Britain and Oregon and U.S. territory. But the big fight would be with Mexico. Now, America's looking to expand all the way to the end, all the way to where California is. And in California, they're having the same kind of situation where the Spanish and Mexican government are allowing for Anglo immigration into the state to help populate it. So California had a huge mixture of a population between Spanish, Indians, a lot of foreigners, a lot of Americans, some British. And so America looks to try to find a way to take Mexico, kind of like they did with Texas, thinking there's enough of us there, maybe we can kind of lay claim to it. Mexico supposedly owes the United States $3 million in damages. And where this number comes from is they start to take in account these border raids where people, from Mexico raid in and take cattle from the north. But the funny part is the exact same thing's happening people from the south, the southern parts of the United States are raiding into Mexico and taking the same thing, but the United States lays claim to their portion, which they say they maintain that Mexico owes us $3 million, and they're like, well, we'll take California and California. Of course, Mexico's not even hearing about it. And then there's a bigger conflict brewing in Texas, and the idea is, where is the border of Texas? Now, that's actually not even a question at the time. As far as like facts, if you look at any map anywhere made before in this time period and before by both the British, French, Spanish, even the American government, the border of Texas is always placed at the Nueces River, which is where Corpus Christi is. From there to a little bit of northern Mexico, where in the Rio Grande Valley, this was Nuevo Santander. It was never part of Mexico. They never mapped it as part of Mexico. But when Texas becomes a country, or an independent state, they start trying to lay claim to spread their border all the way to the Rio Grande Valley. But everyone's like, that's the Rio Grande River, and Mexico, maintains that, like, no, the border is the Nueces. It always has been, always will be. And so this is something that Polk can exploit to start a war. But before he sends someone, he sends as a negotiator, John Slidell, to Mexico City to negotiate for the purchase of California and all the surrounding territory for $25 million. And Mexico's like, we're not giving you half the country for $25 million. You're crazy. In fact, they think this proposition is so crazy, they refuse to even see John Slidell. Polk takes this as a personal insult, like, how dare you not even consider selling half your country? So he decides to provoke Mexico. He orders General Zachary Taylor to the Nueces River, and he occupies that territory just north of the Nueces River. And eventually he gets orders to cross the Nueces. And he even asks why, he even sees these orders as being just created to start a war. His previous orders were to protect Texas, and he's like, I don't see, crossing the border from the Nueces in as protecting Texas. I'm doing just a fine job here. He's trying to get clarification orders because he knows he's about to start a war. Of course, the president reiterates, you must march down to the Rio Grande, and so he does. And this, Zachary Taylor, President Polk, all know that the minute they cross, Mexico will see it as crossing into Mexican territory and retaliate. And that happens just north of Brownsville, in the first battle of the Mexican-American War being Palo Alto. And suddenly Polk is crying that U.S. soldiers' blood was spilled on U.S. soil, and Mexico's like, this is Mexico. And a lot of other people kind of point out, like, wait a minute, this battle actually happened in Mexico. It wasn't in the United States. One guy who actually, he was an unknown at the time, but he stands up to call out the lies of President Polk, is Junior Senator Abraham Lincoln. And he has this long list of reasons why he knows Polk is lying. And he points it out in this, what is now known as the spot resolutions. In the end, Polk gets what he wants. He says, well, they've attacked us, our nation's honor. And Polk is still angry that Mexico won't even, contemplate selling half their country to him. So he asks Congress for a declaration of war, and he gets it. And by this point, you have a lot of people in America looking at this as part of manifest destiny. Yeah, let's go. Let's defeat Mexico and take what's ours. It's part of our destiny. Mexico sees it as a complete invasion. They refer to the bullies of the North. In fact, in their history, they call it the War of American Aggression. What's really funny at this time, Santa Anna is a really interesting guy in history. After the Alamo and the fall of Mexico, he gets kicked out, and Mexico always has a love-hate relationship with him. But you gotta admire how charismatic this guy is. He's been exiled into Cuba. The war starts, and I kid you not, he negotiates with the U.S. government, and they believe him. He tells them that if you take me back into Mexico, I'll end the war and give you what you want. And they're like, okay, so they help him get back to Mexico. And it's at that point that Santa Anna turns around and leads the Mexican army against the U.S. Army. And like I said, you got to admire how charismatic he was, that he tricked the U.S. authorities to get him back into Mexico. As far as the war is concerned, America has a much more modern army at the time and a lot more funding compared to what was going on in Mexico. California is quickly taken because there are already rumblings in California in what is known as the Bear Flag Revolt, much like the Texas War for Independence, in which they were trying to, break free from Mexico anyway. So those two forces combined together to break California out of Mexico. And here in this map, you can really see just how much of territory the United States takes from Mexico with this war. General Taylor does well as he marches south, through Brownsville, keeps going south. But once he gets into the desert area of northern Mexico, it becomes a really hard fight for American forces. This territory is, pretty much occupied by a lot of Native American groups, including the Comanches. And this is just hot desert climate. And even though they're winning, it's a struggle to get through this. So what they decide on a different strategy, and also Zachary Taylor was making such a name for himself that President Polk thought that all these victories are giving General Taylor a big head and he might run for president. So maybe I should take him out of the out of the publicity. So he ends Zachary Taylor's war by recalling forces. And, he's quite right. General Taylor does run and become president later. So he sends another General Winfield Scott to land at Veracruz. And from Veracruz, they march directly into Mexico City, bringing the war to an end. And so what you see with the Civil War also, what you see in the Mexican-American War, is a lot of officers in the Civil War actually served in the Mexican-American War. So this is literally where they get their battlefield experience. So they finally get Santana to sit down and talk with a little bribe of $10,000. Polk is actually calling Trist back home to negotiations, but he wants to stick around. He writes this long 65-page letter saying why he has to stay. And eventually they come up with what is now known as the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848. The treaty confirms the border. It makes a new border. It takes half the country of Mexico. The United States actually agrees to pay for some damages. They do end up giving $15 million to Mexico. It also is supposed to guarantee land rights to those who own land, whether they're Mexican or not, and guarantee U.S. citizenship to those Mexicans now living in American territory. That doesn't really pan out. Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo is something Mexican Americans in general are still dealing with to this day, especially when it comes to issues of land and also citizenship and race. The treaty is submitted to the Senate, and what ends up happening when it gets thrown into the Senate is that a lot of people are looking at the treaty going like, maybe we shouldn't sign it. Maybe we should just take all of Mexico for ourselves. We've already defeated them, so why not just take the whole country? But there's a huge opposition to this because, well, slave versus free, and this would totally make the South more powerful than the North. So eventually they agreed to ratify the treaty as is and not expand further into Mexican territory. The war itself, is not a really big war in numbers. A lot more people died of diseases actually, but man, the U.S. territory expands and becomes the fulfillment of Manifest Destiny. But this will later be territory that the United States will have to conquer because it's filled with Native Americans. And once again, every time we expand territory, that means conquering and killing Native Americans. And the other thing is, like I said, the war in the Mexican-American War also serves as a proving ground for later would become officers in the Confederacy and in the Union in the Civil War. This is where this whole really sad thing, when you listen to the Marine Corps hymn, when they all talk about the halls of Montezuma, one of the last places to fall in Mexico is Chapultepec Castle. And Chapultepec Castle is like the Mexican West Point. There's a bunch of little teenage boys. They're the last ones to fall in the war. In fact, there's a bunch of pillars outside Chapultepec Castle for those Niños Héroes, who fell. One of them leapt from the castle top carrying the Mexican flag so the American army couldn't get it. And this is really where relationships really start to sour between the United States and the rest of Latin America because we're seen as a bully. And honestly, it is the Mexican-American War that is one of the direct causes of the Civil War, because just so much new territory is added, bringing the animosity level even higher between the North and the South. And this will just basically be the beginnings of the Civil War.